I knew more about convicts than I knew about my own culture when I was a child. I remember learning about convicts in primary school, writing assignments about convicts, singing Botany Bay in class when I couldn't sing a single song in my own language. So convicts have always been a part of my consciousness, as I think they have of most Australians. The relevance of that convict history that still exists for me is the establishment of a colonial structure, a colonial apparatus, and the attitudes and levels of racism that we deal with in Australian society. You know, colonialism is a brutal system. Wherever it happened around the world, Indigenous people suffered. And in Australia, we had the unique situation where the British took a particularly heartless view, a more heartless view than they did in any of their other colonies, by considering that the Indigenous people here had absolutely no rights at all to their lands or waters. No treaties, no negotiation, no parity of esteem, no dignity. Nothing like the arrangement in New Zealand or Canada or the United States. And I think to be able to feel comfortable with transferring an entire continent from one people to the next, sounds pretty technical, doesn't it? Transferring a continent from one people to the next, all its waters, its resources, its forests, from one people to another. And then to think that that's completely okay. Generation after generation after generation. To this day, we still think it's the natural order of things, and it's okay. You have to have dehumanised yourself to have dehumanised others that much. You have to have brutalised yourself. And in order to maintain that system, to keep the secrecy happening, to keep the level of psychological comfort in place, you have to pass on myths that dehumanise those people generation after generation after generation, which is what we have in Australian society. You have to keep those people in place. You have to keep them separated from their resources. You have to forget their status in their own land. And we live with that. And we live with, and that's what the reconciliation conversation is about. That's what the Uluru statement from the heart was about. That's what the walk over the Harbour Bridge was about. The national apology for the removal of tens of thousands of Aboriginal children was about. We are still trying to work through that, while at the same time somehow still maintain a colonial apparatus of complete domination of Aboriginal people. It's really tricky because as contemporary Australians, we have a legacy. I think it's certainly not easy being an Indigenous Australian. We are, as a people, the most imprisoned people on earth. Over 30% of children being removed now from their families are Aboriginal children. So the stolen generations continue. it wasn't that long ago, only I think 2 years ago, that the Western Australian government was talking about closing down 500 Aboriginal communities. You know, colonialism is still with us. But I think for non-Indigenous Australians, the difficulty is, where do I fit in that? And how do I live with that? Because as Aboriginal people, we see ourselves as a people, and we see non-Indigenous society, as a people. But I think non-Indigenous people generally see themselves as individuals, not as a society, not as a system. And so the challenge for many non-Aboriginal people is, how do I, as a good, well-intended, moral person, how am I part of this system? How can I possibly consider myself part of a state that has a colonial relationship with its Indigenous population? So there's a psychological, there's not just a political challenge there. There's a psychological challenge there. There's a psychological and emotional challenge for non-Indigenous Australia, and there's a psychological and emotional challenge for us, and that's what we're still trying to work out. And I think that in part is the purpose of including an Aboriginal perspective in any conversation about the Hyde Park Barracks, which is a great thing to be doing.